Picture this. It's 1983. A young woman puts on her welding mask, clocks into a Pittsburgh steel mill, and then, after a long, grueling shift surrounded by fire and sparks, she goes home, cranks up the music, and dances like the whole world is watching. That woman is Alex Owens, and the movie built around her life became one of the most talked about, most imitated, and most misunderstood films of the entire decade. Flashdance, released by Paramount Pictures on April 15, 1983, was not supposed to be a cultural earthquake. It was a scrappy, low-budget drama with a thin script, a first-time movie lead, and a director who had only ever made commercials and music videos. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody in Hollywood, believed it was going to amount to much. And yet, within months of hitting theaters, it had sold over 20 million soundtrack copies worldwide, inspired a fashion revolution, launched the careers of multiple music artists, and permanently changed the way studios market movies. Today we are counting down 15 weird, wild, and wonderful facts about Flashdance that most people have never heard. And trust me, by the time we reach number 1, you'll look at this movie in a completely different light. Let's go. Let's start with the most jaw-dropping open secret in the history of 1980 cinema. Jennifer Beals plays Alex Owens in Flashdance. She is in every scene. Her face, her voice, her expressions, all hers. But her body? That was a rotating crew of specialists, and the studio did everything in its power to make sure the world never found out. The dancing you see on screen was primarily performed by Maureen Jahan, a trained French dancer who handled the vast majority of the jazz and contemporary choreography throughout the film. When the film required gymnastic elements, specifically an aerial backflip, a gymnast named Sharon Shapiro stepped in to deliver the stunt. But perhaps the most extraordinary substitution of all came during the film's climactic audition sequence, specifically the breakdance floor spin that audiences absolutely lost their minds over. That move was performed by a 16-year-old boy named Richard Crazy Legs Colon, a member of the legendary New York City hip-hop crew Rock Steady Crew. Because no female dancer was available who could execute the spin with the same power and precision, Crazy Legs shaved his legs, shaved his underarms, removed a thin mustache he had at the time, pulled on a wig and tights, and went for it. He pulled it off perfectly. And then Paramount buried his name, along with Maureen Jahan's, in the deepest vaults they could find. Jahan received zero on-screen credit. She was reportedly told by the studio that publicizing her involvement would break the magic of the illusion they were selling. When the truth came out, largely because journalists noticed her name was simply absent from any official documentation, it sparked a real controversy that genuinely damaged her career. Jennifer Beals, to her credit, has spoken publicly and warmly about her doubles many times over the years. But by then, the film had already run its course, and the damage to Jahan was already done. Before Flashdance, dance movies were already popular. Saturday Night Fever had turned disco into a religion in 1977. Fame had convinced a generation of teenagers in 1980 that spontaneous street performance was a reasonable lifestyle choice. But neither of those films produced quite the same level of real-world behavioral change that Flashdance managed. Dance school enrollment across the United States spiked dramatically in the months following the film's release. The key distinction was the style of dance people wanted to learn. Traditional ballet academies saw modest gains, but jazz studios, contemporary movement classes, and anything even vaguely resembling the high-energy, sweat-drenched choreography from the film's most famous sequences saw absolutely overwhelming demand. Instructors at the time described turning students away week after week because their classes were completely full. Women who had never once considered dancing as a hobby drove across town to audition for beginner classes. The film tapped into something deeply aspirational, the idea that passion, grit, and the right soundtrack could bridge the gap between where you were and where you wanted to be. In the summer of 1983, Michael Jackson's Thriller was not just an album. It was a force of nature. It had spent 17 consecutive weeks at number 1 on the Billboard 200. It was, in every measurable sense, the dominant cultural object of the moment, a record that seemed entirely unmovable by anything short of an act of God. On June 25, 1983, Flashdance moved it. The Flashdance soundtrack climbed to the top of the Billboard 200 and held that position for 2 full weeks before Thriller eventually clawed its way back. For context on how remarkable this was, only 2 albums managed to dethrone Thriller during its entire initial chart run. Flashdance was the first. The Police's Synchronicity was the second, arriving just weeks later. Footloose would repeat the trick the following year, establishing dance movie soundtracks as the only reliable kryptonite for Michael Jackson's commercial dominance. The engine behind the Flashdance soundtrack success was a pair of singles that became inescapable. Flashdance, What a Feeling, performed by Irene Cara, and Maniac, performed by Michael Sembello, dominated radio and MTV for months. The soundtrack ultimately sold over 20 million copies worldwide, a figure that remains staggering for a film that critics largely dismissed as shallow entertainment. This one genuinely sounds like someone made it up. They did not. Maniac is now one of the most recognizable workout anthems in the history of popular music. It soundtracks montages. It powers gym playlists. It has been sampled and referenced and covered endlessly for 4 decades. The image it conjures is pure sweaty, joyful, kinetic energy. Alex Owens spinning and leaping in her home studio, working herself toward a dream. The original song was about a man who kills cats and nails them to the floor. Songwriter Dennis McCoskey had watched a television news segment about a real serial killer and found himself reaching for a notepad. He brought the concept to recording artist Michael Sembello, and the 2 of them rented a horror film called Maniac, released in 1980, to help flesh out the lyrical tone. The original chorus, as confirmed by those involved in the writing process, went along the lines of, "He's a maniac, maniac, that's for sure. He'll kill your cat and nail it to the floor." A demo ended up on a cassette tape that found its way to music supervisor Phil Ramone, who was compiling material for the Flashdance soundtrack. Director Adrian Lyne heard it and became fixated on a 2-note melodic chime in the bridge of the song, a sound he later described as something like bing, bong, bing, bong. He built the entire training montage sequence around that sound. There was, however, the small matter of the lyrics still being about homicidal violence toward household pets. Ramone asked Sembello to rewrite them. The cat-killing serial killer became a woman dancing like she had never danced before. Radio responded accordingly. The image is iconic. Alex Owens in a chair, a spotlight cutting through darkness, and then a chain pulled overhead releases a cascade of water that drenches her completely. It lasts a handful of seconds on screen. It took an almost absurd amount of effort to produce. Director Adrian Lyne later described the entire sequence as a production nightmare from beginning to end. The volume and weight of the water pouring down was significant enough that the crew genuinely discussed the possibility of the force breaking the performer's neck. Lyne spent considerable time working on the lighting, initially shooting against a white background before realizing that sparkling water only registers visually when it is backlit against deep darkness. Every component of the shot, the timing of the water release, the position of the lights, the choreography of the performer, had to be coordinated precisely, and they were resetting between each take. Getting the sequence approved in the first place was its own production. Lyne had to pitch the concept to approximately 30 studio executives who were seated on bleachers inside a soundstage. He stood at the bottom, wrapped a yellow garden hose around a stand-in, and physically acted out what he had in mind. The room was, by every account he has given over the years, deeply unimpressed. He got his approval anyway, and what followed became arguably the most replicated visual moment of the entire decade. Flashdance arrived in theaters long before the kind of photosensitivity warnings that are now standard on video games, broadcast television, and streaming content. Looking back, this is remarkable because the film's production pushed strobe lighting to extremes that were genuinely unprecedented in mainstream cinema at the time. The training montage, Maniac playing, Alex moving through her home workout, was shot using strobes flashing at a rate of 6 times per second, synchronized directly to the film camera. People who have studied the technical history of cinema believe this may have been one of the earliest instances of camera-synchronized strobe lighting used in a major theatrical release. It was a genuine innovation in visual filmmaking. It was also, frankly, brutal to be around. Crew members working on set during the filming of that sequence had to physically remove themselves from the environment not because of fatigue or scheduling issues, but because they could not tolerate the sustained exposure to the flashing light. The sequence has since been cited by researchers studying photosensitive epilepsy as a textbook example of the rapid flash visual style that can trigger seizures. The modern broadcast standards that govern how quickly images can flash on television and in streaming content exist in part because of the exact techniques Adrian Lyne was pioneering during this production. If Flashdance sometimes feels less like a traditional narrative film and more like a feature-length music video with a love story loosely stitched through it, there is a perfectly logical explanation for that. The screenplay was, for much of the production, a work in progress. The original script was written by journalist and former magazine editor Tom Headley, who sold his draft to Casablanca Records in 1980 for $300,000 plus a share of the net profits. It bounced between production companies for 2 years, passing through Polygram before landing at Paramount, where it sat untouched in what the industry calls turnaround, a polite term for being ignored, for another 2 years. Don Simpson, who had been a senior executive at Paramount, resigned his studio position specifically so he could produce the film independently, partnering with Jerry Bruckheimer. They brought in screenwriter Joe Esterhaas to rewrite Headley's draft, and those rewrites were still happening as cameras began rolling in Pittsburgh in October of 1982. Finding a director was its own extended ordeal. David Cronenberg read the script and passed, reportedly saying he would destroy the movie. Brian De Palma turned it down to go make Scarface instead. Adrian Lyne rejected the project twice, calling it slight and unconvincing, before agreeing on a third approach, partly, by his own admission, because he wanted Paramount's goodwill for a different project he was developing. With a thin story and a lead actress who was not a professional dancer, Lyne defaulted to what he knew from advertising: pure visual energy, montage, light, music, and movement. Critics saw through it immediately. Audiences did not care. The rapid cuts, the camera finding an isolated hand, a pair of hips, a set of feet, the editing bay doing as much choreographic work as the dancers themselves. The entire visual language of Flashdance, the thing that made it feel electric and modern and different from anything audiences had seen in a dance film before. None of it was invented by Adrian Lyne. It came from Bob Fosse. Fosse had been building this visual vocabulary since at least 1969, working it through Sweet Charity, refining it in Cabaret, perfecting it in All That Jazz. He deliberately fractured the traditional presentation of dance on film, the approach Fred Astaire had established, which kept the dancer fully visible in a wide shot and let the choreography speak for itself, and replaced it with an editorial style that found rhythm and meaning in fragments. Dance historians have a term for it: Fosse time. The critical difference is what the technique meant in Fosse's hands versus what it became in Lyne's. Fosse used fragmentation as a philosophical statement, a way of examining how performance dehumanizes performers, how the camera reduces people to their most commercially appealing parts. There was an argument underneath every cut. Lyne used the same technique because Jennifer Beals could not execute the choreography required by the script, and rapid editing was the most effective way to conceal that fact. A genuine artistic statement became a production workaround, and then that workaround became enormously influential, spawning a generation of dance films and music videos that kept the visual style and quietly discarded any meaning it once carried. Before Flashdance was a cultural phenomenon, it was a punchline. The script had been circulating long enough that most serious players in Hollywood had already seen it and decided they wanted nothing to do with it. The casting process for Alex Owens was chaotic from the beginning. Among those who auditioned was Kyra Sedgwick, then a teenager, who reportedly told Adrian Lyne mid-read to stop answering his phone and pay attention to her. She had also ignored her agent's advice to wear a leotard and showed up in a miniskirt and heels instead. She did not get the role. She has since acknowledged that telling a director to hang up the phone is not a reliable path to employment. The final shortlist came down to Jennifer Beals, Demi Moore, and an actress named Leslie Wing. How Beals ultimately won the part depends entirely on which version of the story you find credible. One account credits Paramount president Michael Eisner with asking female secretaries at the studio to watch screen tests and vote for their favorite. A second account, from screenwriter Joe Esterhaas, suggests Eisner gathered around 200 male crew members, teamsters, grips, electricians, and asked a considerably less professional question. Either way, Beals was chosen. The male lead had its own remarkable near misses. Kevin Costner, then completely unknown, was paid $200 to lie in a bed next to Beals during her screen test. He did not get the part. Gene Simmons of Kiss was offered the role and declined, citing a conflict with his stage persona. Pierce Brosnan, Robert De Niro, Richard Gere, Mel Gibson, Tom Hanks, and John Travolta were all reportedly considered before the role went to Michael Nouri. In the summer of 1983, Jennifer Beals was one of the most recognizable young faces on the planet. Flashdance had turned her into a global star essentially overnight. Magazine covers, interview requests, major studio offers. The full machinery of Hollywood celebrity had locked onto her and was not letting go. She went back to Yale anyway. Beals had been a sophomore at Yale University when she was cast. She deferred a single term to film Flashdance. The film opened in the spring of 1983, and she returned to school for her sophomore year as though she had simply taken a semester abroad. She turned down Joel Schumacher's St. Elmo's Fire, a film that would go on to make stars of an entire generation of young actors because it conflicted with her studies. Her agents reportedly told her she was walking away from millions of dollars and a career trajectory that would not wait. Her response was essentially that she would only have one opportunity to be a college student with her peers, and she was not willing to trade that for fame. The only film she made during her college years was The Bride in 1985, shot during a summer break and co-starring Sting. She graduated from Yale with honors in 1987, earning a Bachelor of Arts in American Literature. While her contemporaries were chasing the momentum that 1983 had handed them, she was writing papers and attending lectures and being, by all accounts, a regular. The central love story in Flashdance is presented as a sweeping, romantic affair. Nick Hully, wealthy and charming, falls for the spirited and talented Alex Owens, and the film frames this as something beautiful. What the film does not particularly dwell on is the arithmetic involved. Jennifer Beals was 18 years old, turning 19 during production. Michael Nouri was 36, turning 37 by the end of the shoot. The age difference between them was 18 years. IMDb's trivia section still notes plainly that Beals was literally half her co-star's age during filming. In 1983, this was not a conversation that critics or audiences were particularly interested in having. But the age gap is only part of the power dynamic the film asks viewers to accept as romantic. Nick Hurley is not a stranger Alex meets at a party. He is her employer. He owns the steel mill where she works. He is her boss, and she is a teenage welder on his payroll. At one point, he uses his professional influence to arrange a prestigious dance audition for her without asking her permission or even consulting her about it. The film in 1983 presented this as a grand gesture of love. The film today reads considerably differently. Adrian Lyne himself, reflecting on the film at its 40th anniversary, acknowledged that the dynamic between the two characters does not land the same way it once did. What 1983 audiences saw as romance, contemporary viewers tend to read as a document of power. The character of Alex Owens was not invented from nothing. She was drawn primarily from the life of a real woman named Maureen Martyr, a Toronto resident who worked in construction during the day and performed as a dancer at night at a club called Gimlet's. Tom Headley, the screenwriter who created the original draft, had worked as an editor at Toronto Life magazine and knew Martyr personally, along with several other dancers at the same club. A second Toronto dancer named Gina Healy also contributed elements to the composite character. When the film was in production, Martyr signed a standard release document on December 6, 1982. The amount she received for signing away her life story, her experiences, and her identity as the foundation of one of the most commercially successful films of the decade was $2,300. No royalties, no back-end participation, no ongoing interest of any kind. A flat check, a signature, and that was the end of it. Flashdance ultimately grossed over $150 million domestically. The story resurfaced 2 decades later when Jennifer Lopez released a music video for her 2003 single, I'm Glad. A video that did not merely reference Flashdance, but reproduced its most iconic visual moments almost shot for shot. The chair, the water, the leg warmers, the audition sequence. Lopez compressed the entire film into 4 minutes of choreography. Martyr, watching it, decided to sue. She filed claims against Lopez, Sony, and Paramount, attempting to establish a copyright interest in the underlying story. In June of 2006, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against her. The 1982 release she had signed was legally airtight. The court acknowledged in its ruling that the deal appeared to be unfair, and then they ruled against her anyway. Take a moment to appreciate the full absurdity of this. Flashdance, a film that became famous in part because its lead actress could not dance, requiring a team of body doubles and aggressive editing techniques to simulate the performance, was adapted into a stage musical, a form of entertainment where the lead performer must dance live, in front of a paying audience, 8 times a week, with no cuts, no substitutions, and no camera tricks available. Flashdance the musical premiered in the United Kingdom in 2008 and subsequently toured internationally for years, with productions running through the West End, multiple European countries, and a full North American tour in 2013. The stage version expanded the romance, added new musical numbers, and gave greater depth to secondary characters. But the essential structure of the story, welder by day, dancer by night, climactic audition at the end, remained exactly as Headley had originally written it. Every actress cast as Alex Owens in the stage version had to do everything that the film had assembled a team of specialists to fake. The jazz choreography that Maureen Jahan performed, the aerial work, the chair sequence, complete with water, live, every night, with no editing bay to rescue anyone. A film built on the impossibility of finding one person who could do it all became a theatrical property that required exactly that, night after night, for years. One of the most imitated fashion looks of the entire 1980s began with Jennifer Beals leaving a sweatshirt in the dryer for too long. The garment in question was a gray sweatshirt she had owned since high school, a personal favorite that she wore regularly. She left it in on high heat for an extended cycle, and when she retrieved it, the neck hole had shrunk to the point where it could no longer fit over her head. Most people would throw away a shrunken sweatshirt. Beals instead picked up a pair of scissors, removed the collar entirely, and kept wearing it around the house. She wore it to a wardrobe, fitting for Flashdance. Adrian Lyne saw it on her immediately and wanted it in the film. Costume designer Michael Kaplan, who had also designed the wardrobe for Blade Runner, took Beals' DIY modification and refined it for the camera, keeping the spirit of the original accident while making it work visually on screen.